Hey, I'm very happy to be here today with Michael, Matthew, and Nate. And we are going to talk about part 5 of Radical Orthodoxy. And this is really good for my brain. So this time, part 5 of these are kind of the 5 main points of Radical Orthodoxy. And point number 5 is quite lengthy. So rather than reading the whole thing at one time, we're just going to read a section at a time and then talk about it. So I'll read the first couple of sentences here and then I'll open it up to you guys. Radical Orthodoxy is influenced by postmodern thought, but at the same time contests it. Postmodernity tends to conclude that since we cannot ground truth in an absolutely certain intuitive presence, nor in discursivity, which is either tautologous or else goes on forever and never vanquishes uncertainty, that in consequence, there is no such thing as truth at all. So what do you make of that?
One thing I want to note on a stylistic level is there is nothing flamboyant about the language. It is phrasally precise, and it hits its phrases in an order that is intentional. It's not him sitting down and getting something out, cutting loose. It is it's like a piano piece. And I say that especially with remark to where he puts the word consequence or conclusion, wherever that was.
Could you elaborate on that, Matthew?
Well, I don't really have anything to say in elaboration about the style other than a kind of coordinating effect for our discussion, that it's not as if we're trying to, in my opinion, hermeneutically, it's not as if we're trying to find the meaning in the gobbledygook and the spaghetti sauce of this verbose sentence. It's not verbose. It's so meaningful that it resembles a constraint problem, which segues from our last conversation. There is so much phenomenology there, not even to mention his use of the word presence, which is meta. The whole thing is presence. And the ordering of his phrases to come down to a conclusion flies in the face of a postmodern vomit of pure subjectivity. So it's being very, very sophisticated and very, very dense on purpose. And so I don't really know, to Nathaniel, how to approach it. I think we're doing the right thing by approaching it in mass as a group, but that's where I leave off.
Well, when you say that, it reminds me of the last few paragraphs of Maps of Meaning, because that's exactly what it is. It says, though the entire book has been explicating these ideas, and then as the book gets towards the last chapter, it's condensing, and then the very last few paragraphs are the entire book condensed into 2 paragraphs. So when you read those paragraphs, if you've read the book, the whole book unspools in your mind out of those 2 paragraphs. So I'm guessing that he wrote these paragraphs after, or he and Catherine or whoever was involved in this, they wrote this after they had already thought through the whole corpus of their ideas, right? It's not like they said, oh, let's have 7 points of radical orthodoxy and then let's write a book out of these 7 points. I don't think it's like that at all. I think they've thought it all through and condensed it down to this little zip bomb.
Right. I'm sure it was I'm pretty sure it was written after the first Radical Orthodoxy collection of essays. So yeah, that would definitely.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. I don't know exactly, but I think it was sometime in the. It was like in the 2000s. Like it was certainly well after lots and lots of material had been written, and this to me to try to be an attempt to clear up some confusion around the subject overall, and give a maximally compressed kind of clarification of here's where we are and here's where we sit within the spectrum of ideas.
Right.
So why do they want to contest postmodernism? I mean, a lot of other people are
Well,
jumping into the postmodern pool right now, so.
the important part of that is that it's not just that they want to contest it, but they also are embracing the tools of postmodernism at the same time, right? So if your first principles are not grounded in the finite, then the postmodern tools are not a threat to you. I might be actually moving ahead of myself in the
Well,
paragraph,
wait a
but
minute, could you say the first
yeah.
half of that sentence again, Nate? If
So
you're,
it's not just that they're contesting postmodernism, it's that they're contesting postmodernism while at the same time embracing the tools of postmodernism.
yes, but then you said
So,
if,
and the reason, so the point of difference is that the reason that it is able to go beyond the postmodern, narrative is that the narrative that's not a narrative. The reason it's able to go beyond that is because it's taking it. So postmodernism is pretty invincible against anything that takes its first principles as grounded in the finite. It's very, very easy to demonstrate from any finite first principles that they will break down in precisely the way that postmodernism alleges that it does. So you embrace the postmodern tools in order to critique modernity, right? But at the same, but alternatively, you're grounding yourself in first principles that are not finite.
And if I could supplement that, because I agree with you so much, Nathaniel, I want to bring a real world example of the postmodern exercise that perhaps this article, even if it's beyond the author's intention, is responding to indirectly, is the work of Derrida in his focus upon the aporia, that is the, as you said so well, the crack or fissure in the finite waiting to be ripped with a wrench or a crowbar, that the conservatives, the ultra conservatives, will not admit, and that's crucial, will not admit. So it partakes of a religious language, a confessio, alongside the intellectual tradition of the particular stomps it's making to the exclusion of others. So for example, a too literalistic reading of Genesis, and I'm not talking about old earth versus newer earth. I'm talking about the mode of operation of that which is outside the finite to bring the finite into arrangement. If there is a certain fixation on the mouth, orality, sermio, God spoke the world into existence, and authority presides in oracular judgment or oracular being, king, monarch, priest, pastor, giving a homily, however you want to cash it out. That is taking some infinite creation, ex nihilo, however we want to phrase it, we haven't quite located it yet. If you start nudging it towards a center, the mouth, for instance, then the postmodern will rightly come with his erasure, Derrida's erasure, and say, you're all a bunch of logocentrics putting a bunch of words in the mouth. God doesn't have a mouth, you fools. And then it goes on from there, the conclusion. And in a certain respect, he's right. And it's so simple because it's the butt end of a joke, this anthropomorphic mistake, that it bleeds its way into popular culture very rapidly. And that's part of the power of postmodernity. It can go from the high elite into popular culture rapidly.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that. And I would say that I think the key to that, talking about it from the point of view of Genesis, is that the key to that is the way that the postmodern narrative is overcome is that you accept the postmodern critique that all rationally constructive narratives are reducible to power, but that means that you have to outcompete it with a narrative that is not based on power, which is why Nietzsche chooses Christianity specifically as his target. He knows what his proper target is. So this is why I think there's a point in theology and social theory where Milbank says that the sort of neo-paganism that postmodernity generates doesn't have the doesn't have the advantage of the naivete of classical paganism, which was unaware of its own violent nature, whereas the postmodern neo-paganism is explicitly aware of its reducibility to violence. So the only way to overcome it is with a narrative of nonviolence, which is the Christian narrative.
I feel as if we need to allow an impregnation of concepts to the use of our word violent, because certainly historically speaking, we've seen a violent march, but we apply the word violent retrospectively. On their way to the Capitol, were they violently intending violence on marble, on stone, on wood? And in many ways, in that respect, the Capitol March that happened recently is algebraically synonymous with the 3-day hike of Fear and Trembling, which is precisely what Kierkegaard, in the vein of Nietzsche, explored. He wasn't really concerned with the act of raising the knife over his son's head. He was concerned primarily with the 3-day walk in which Abraham had to live with himself on the way to an activity. What was going through his mind? That's the question. Can it be historically canvassed what was going on in his mind?
Well, okay. Can I want to go back to something that Matt said when you were talking about too much focus on the oral nature of the word, the spoken truth. You know, Jordan Peterson is always saying that the truth spoken, if it actually is the truth and it's spoken, what it brings into being is good. But he also says that that our values are not what we say our values are, they're what we live, how we act. So when I look at Genesis and it says that God spoke and it was, that is not an oral act. It's not just oral, it is it's an action. And what that action consists of is, well, there's a whole lot wrapped up in that, but I mean, it's an action. And that, well, it's communication, but I was talking about this the other day with Mary, that all good communication is an action of love. Love acted out is what good communication is, because when you're communicating, there are a lot of risks involved, and there's a lot of fear involved. There's just a lot involved with communicating, and it requires an action. So can we define that is maybe one of the differences with the postmodern idea about trying to erase the words, is if their focus is on, you can just say things and decide whether there's meaning there or not. Because what I see is a lot of these young people that are following the postmodern siren song, they're all about the words. They say they're not about the words, but they're all about the words and not about the actions. They have this big idea that they're going to build this new world at Capitol Hill in Seattle, and they have all the big ideas, but the whole thing collapses because the action is not there. The risk, the intentionality, the effort doesn't go along with the words.
And notice how close, I just want to put a ribbon as a bookmark into what you said, because I think it's so profound. Notice the approximation to a certain kind of prayer, a posture of prayer, where you imagine stereotypically someone with a veil, someone alone, someone secluded, someone with their hands cupped, someone looking at something, just looking, and then repeating a litany, repeating mythopoetic language for quite a long time in duration, and then getting up and maybe making some stew. In other words, there's this violent juxtaposition of the sacred, the profound, for what? it's consecrated to some ordinary tasks. Algebraically, that's very similar to the Capitol Hill phraseology, like you mentioned, the Marxism on Earth, and then going about their coding job or new journalism or whatever it may be. It doesn't matter. Juxtaposition. So it all seems to the indoctrination process and the living out simulates kind of prayer, monkish, weirdly gestalt-like prayer.
Okay, we got most of that, Matt, but we're having the same problem with your internet. So
Oh.
or maybe it's my internet.
It might be. I think I caught most of that. But I'll say this just to keep us within the frame. I think the violence of the postmodernism in the power games is a further move, and maybe is a little bit outside the frame for the what we're talking about today. Which what comes first is this lack of truth, right? And the reason that there is that lack is specifically this lack of foundations, right? And so it's because, as Nate really pointed out really well, if you're grounded in the finite, postmodernism comes along and says, okay, you have one of two problems. There are no foundations because you can find the crack in them. You can go on this problem of infinite regress where you always find a crack in that lower layer, or it's tautologous, right? So there's the illusion of some sort of argument, but really it's, the premise and the conclusion are really the same thing, right? It's just a sort of word game where you're just playing out your assumptions in a way that looks like you're doing some argumentation, but you're not. So what you're left with then is no foundations, and with no foundations, you get this no truth. No truth equals this nullity, right? This lack. And I think further along, postmodernism comes in to assert, okay, well, something's got to fill that void. And so it starts from that void and starts making all kinds of assumptions about, well, what must be true then? Well, if there is no real, there's no way of measuring merit to how I act, then these people must be just doing it based on some sort of selfish or, power games motives. So then I must do so as well, right? I must act accordingly. Foist all
out in our extreme left of politics. It's not like it's just the left that's postmodern. No, the right is thoroughly postmodern too. We live in a thoroughly postmodern culture with these postmodern factions that are absolutely just like tearing the world apart. I mean, it's not as if it's just postmodernism exists only on one side of the political spectrum. We have two different competing neo-pagan postmodern narratives that are with each other, and that's why we live in chaos.
And
I think this.
one. Mhm.
No, go ahead.
Hold on a second, guys. I'm getting a lot of disturbance when you guys are talking. Are you all hearing each other okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so can we have somebody else start taping so that we at least have one version of part of it that's complete? Who wants to do that?
I just hit record. I'm getting.
I allowed you to record. Okay.
Great.
So at least we'll
Okay.
have this from at least one side.
I don't know that worked because it says please ask the host, and then
Yeah.
and
So,
then
okay. So let me fix that up then. Now it should work.
okay, I'm recording now as well.
Okay, so I want to use to that point of we're all imitating each other in the void of not being able to have a Euclidean point in the infinite to ground our propositions here and now. So ethics is out the window with the baby, to use Peterson's phrase, baby in bathwater. I want to use the homophone of the cue. We all take our cue, CUE, from each other now. What to do next? As there was a time, once upon a time, when we had a cue, QUE, however you spell that, awaiting.
QUEUE.
Thank you. a waiting queue where you could reside in the infinite. Before the Romantics came along with Wordsworth saying, a flower is more than the flower, it's where I recollect my past in tranquility. That's a kind of remembrance of the queue, but it's a subjective enclosure because you have to convince through your poetry that it's real. Whereas once upon a time, there was no secular. The world was a queue. It was waiting for the eschaton. It was waiting for the gestalt to be tweaked into a horizon. And I think everyone and their dog thinks they've got the skinny on the horizon. And so they're trying to persuade by their poetry, which for most people is attract, or what CNN said, or a buzzing line. And I'm saying this in a caricature way to underline that we can't escape using metonymy. We're all using metaphor. And it's what we want our metaphors to stand in for that really gets underneath the surface of how we're using language and how we're praying to one another. Because maybe instead of imitation, actually what we could see is that we are praying to one another in the communicative act.
I think I want to pick up on something that you were alluding to there, which is just this loss of patience. It seems to be underlying a lot of the phenomena because, Luke always likes to talk about, honest postmoderns versus the ones that are playing the power games. And the big differentiator is, I think, patience, right? If you take your game to its conclusion, you end up in a scenario where if you're really honest, you should see that you're this sort of pile of logic grounded in the finite is a big piece of crap and throw it away. And so the unwillingness to do that and the unwillingness to look beyond to see the representations, as Barfield would put it, to see them iconically, illustriously, to see them, but then also see through them. Is it the lack there is patience, and I can see all these sorts of trending aspects of the way we experience consciousness now that is pushing us away from that patience.
Could I add a little on to that idea of patience? Patience is that space, right? It's not just the willingness to wait, but it's the space in which the waiting takes place. And that space is also filled with, so listening is akin to patience. When Jordan Peterson talks about when you truly listen to another person, you're listening because you're acknowledging that you don't know and there's something you can learn. So it's in that space of making friends with the unknown, the idea that Satan in Paradise Lost knows everything there is to know. He has no need outside of himself, but that when we're willing to make friends with the unknown, then we are pulling away from that aspect of evil. So there's something about listening and patience, and then there's something about the silence. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen any of the conversations that I've had with Annette Poisner, who is a psychologist from Ontario, Toronto, I think. And she wrote a really interesting article recently called The Pregnant Pause. And I just want to read a little bit of it because I think it fits in here. She said, as much as there are paragons, those with an amazing capacity to wield speech in a powerful way, we must give some credit to the corollary state of silence, that fertile state associated with receptivity and learning is the most pregnant of all. Without it, the therapist, the hypnotist, the educator get nowhere. A similar notion is found in Torah scholarship. The sage who scribes each Torah is sanctioned to leave specific blank spaces on the parchment between particular chapters. Rabbi Weinberg describes these visual breaks as the sanctified and graphic illustration of the student's need for pause. The silence is as essential as the speaking, and offers Rollo May's conception of the pause as an active, nimble, often intense state. It's a state that allows integration to occur, creativity to blossom, learnings to accrue. Weinberg likens it to the artist's negative space, the jazz player's afterbeat, and the mystic's void. No wonder the sages describe silence as a primary pathway to achieving greatness.
Yeah, there's
I was
a lot
especially
there.
struck by that part in there about the silence is akin to the negative space in art, because in a work of art, the negative space is what actually defines what's there. When you have problems drawing something because it's maybe too complex, or your left brain takes over and you start inserting the way you think it looks rather than the way it actually looks, the way that you can pull yourself back and actually get the shape itself is by drawing what is around the shape instead of the shape itself. So you're drawing the negative space. So the negative space actually defines the boundaries in a more useful, productive, functional, creative manner than drawing the thing itself. Does that make sense the way I'm tying it in?
And this is where Kierkegaard, this is how Kierkegaard defines faith, or phenomenologically how he says you will see faith when it occurs in nature. With what you just said. He used the language of by virtue of the absurd, or to take the Latin away from it, the excellence of the unsaid. On the 3 days, he rode in silence. When his son asked him, where's the sacrifice? He gave in a platitude, a stock phrase, God will provide. But that stock phrase was necessary to direct attention away from itself, interestingly enough, to the width of possibility. That is, in fact, the original meaning of God will provide. So faith is a work of art in the negative space.
Yeah, two things there. Patience, first of all, I think is important to be, and it's being gestured at, and everything you guys are saying is not killing time, right? It's not just filling in the gaps between these two things. You know, like I started X, I invested some money, and now I'm going to kill some time while it makes some money for me, or something like that. And I often at times can conceptualize myself as a patient person. I often think because I'm good at killing time. You know, there's a million things I can be distracted by, or you know, kill some time with, because of just the nature of how my mind works. And I can say, oh, I'm being patient, you know, but it's really what's being described here is a very intense focus. And part of what you were alluding to there in the negative space, Karen, makes me think about something I always brought into contemplation with Barfield, which is when you're reading a text and you're looking at a series of words, does the meaning of those words, does it reside in the words themselves, or does it reside in the context? And okay, and we always say there's some interplay between those two. But I would say if you were going to divide it up percentage-wise, the meaning is infinitely more in the context than it is in the words themselves. It's if you were going to divide it up on any sort of percentage level, like it's so much above and beyond, right? And this is why that patience is so important, because the words have to be viewed iconically to view into that context that surrounds them, and that is way more important. And we love words because we have a sort of facility with them that allows this sort of quick get to the concept, make the assumption, don't do the patience thing. But that's where we stumble.
I would just suggest that you are part of the context and that
Yeah.
you participate in creating the meaning.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And not only you, the person who wrote it and the person
Yeah.
who's reading it, the space between them as well, right?
Well, and every person that's uttered any of those words to you in any context previously.
Yes.
And if it's truly beautiful, it participates in God.
Yes. Because communication is at the heart of the creation.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to paragraph, not paragraph 2, but to the next sentence. And we've covered this to some extent already, but maybe there's something else in here. The last phrase of the previous sentence was, so that in consequence, according to the postmodernists, there is no such thing as truth at all. Often this lack of truth is seen as the only truth, and so discloses a nullity at the heart of things. Radical orthodoxy accepts that there are no foundations and that there can be no finite certainty, but concludes that this situation can be read as the need to refer time to eternity. Now, we covered most of what that says already, but this last phrase is a huge question mark in my mind. I have no idea what he means. There can be no finite certainty, but concludes that this situation can be read as the need to refer time to eternity. What is
I think it's what Nate was.
Yeah, that's
Nate
exactly
could
what
probably
I meant.
expound this. Yeah, but yeah, it was what he meant with
that's what I meant.
the putting those foundations outside of the finite, in the infinite, in the eternal.
It's really comes down to like it's a matter of like, so in a way it's a move beyond rationality, I would say, because it's like you can the postmodernist case is rationally coherent, right? I mean, its breakdown of rational truth is, ironically enough, is a rationally coherent argument. So it's if you can only turn to finite foundations, I don't see a way of resisting the postmodern critique. However, if you assume that there is an infinite in which you can be grounded, you're beyond the possibility of postmodern critique. But you also can't rationally demonstrate that. But it's just, and you can't ever rationally demonstrate first principles anyway, right? So it's just yeah, I think that's, I just want to leave it at that and then let other people elaborate.
So the rational go ahead, Michael.
I was just going to say quickly that if you were a patient and honest postmodern, you would come to the point that all your rationality, logic, whatever you want to call it, at the end you would have to distrust it.
Yeah, you would end up having to reject all the sort of like neo-Nietzschean French Marxist moves. You would end up having to reject because there's really no basis for any of that. Like so postmodernism various schools of postmodernism can actually be also deconstructed using postmodern tools. So in some ways, Nietzsche is the only really honest postmodernist. So it's like you can have the Nietzschean narrative of power, or you can have the Christian narrative of charity and reconciliation. Pick your narrative and what you want to live into.
And this is similar analogously to a writer who's waiting for the muse to show up. So for instance, it dawned on me at the coffee shop. You gather your friends together, you lock them in the room with you, and you go to the proverbial whiteboard and you open your magnificent, infinitely long, just right black magic marker, and you say, I'm about to explain to you everything. Well, it's impossible. The marker will never touch the surface of the whiteboard because you can't break the system.
That's right.
With the infinite comprehensiveness. And this is in fact what the postmoderns in their more lucid moments already gave the algebra of. This is the idea from Rousseau: man is free, but everywhere he is in chains. Derrida took that and spoke of, actually Derrida didn't do this. I think the name escapes me. I'll say it was either
Leconte,
Derrida
maybe?
or Levinas. What?
I was going to say Leconte maybe, but
Oh, I think you're right, actually. Precisely, thank you. Of the idea of the deferment. Meaning is a system of signs that are characterized by their deferment of their meaning to some other sign. So the proverbial example is go to a dictionary and how do words define themselves? By referring to other words. This is in fact the postmodern recognition that meaning is always deferred in this lifetime to other objects that defer. And so it's like giving up. It's like you get close and then you see horizon opening. And this was emblematized as a chain for the postmodern Derrida. There's always this linkage of one thing to the next, but ultimately resembles a chain that you can't pull to the end of. And this is characterized as the finite.
yeah, and that's the discursivity that Milbank is referring to here. This thing that goes on forever that you can't ever get to the end of.
Well, so I just have to throw this in here. There's some advantages to being stupid, because when I read
You're
that,
not stupid. You are not stupid. Don't say that about
Well,
yourself.
there might be a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Let's put it this way. I have some wisdom because of experience, but I don't have very much knowledge. And when I first read this section, I had to look up the word discursivity, because what is he talking about? And I immediately go and I look it up, and on the online it shows two different definitions, and they're opposite to each other. Exactly opposite. So I emailed Michael, desperately, and I said, what is this? These two different definitions. One of them is this linkage that goes on and on and on forever in this rational chain. And the other one is this wandering around, just saying a lot of things that aren't connected to each other, which is kind of the way I talk. And they're both considered discursivity. And I thought, well, that's really weird, So then Michael explained it to me from the standpoint of this paragraph, what the meaning is. And that totally made sense, because he found a third meaning on Google. And but this morning I was thinking about the way my brain works. I'm always like going down these rabbit trails. I have a thought in my mind that I'm concerned with, and I ought to just focus on that thought and study up on that thing, like getting ready for us this morning. But that's not the way my mind works. I'll see some post-it that I had from years ago up there, and I'll look at that, and then that'll send me off looking at another article, and that'll send me to YouTube, and I'll hit the algorithm, and I'll go off on a bunch of different bunny trails. And then I thought, bunny trails, what is it about bunny trails? They lead you into the forest. They lead you deeper and deeper into the forest. And so you get massive exposure to the unknown. And there's something transcendent about getting all that exposure to the unknown. Now, you have to rein it in once in a while and come back to the world that we live in order to find a focus and make it useful and productive in this world. But I think that is also discursivity. The bunny trails is also, at least from the definitions that were online, that was what it was talking about. But that, in that sense, I'm discursive, but I'm not discursive in the rational sense. Maybe that's the difference between men and women. Is that possible?
I don't know. I think maybe it's just like, I think it's more to do, I don't know if it's really gendered so much as it's just like different ways of thinking. Like, I think what you described is like, for people who have whose way of thinking is more about synthesizing, of like grabbing things from lots of different quadrants and kind of like trying to assemble them together, as opposed to people who are more comfortable thinking within a closed box system that doesn't allow much from the outside. I think that's more of a temperamental psychological sort of difference than it is. I mean, maybe it's more associated. Maybe women tend more than men to think in a synthetic way more, and less of a systems way. But certainly not all men are systems thinkers.
So you would say that the systems and the synthetic method are kind of two opposing methods?
Yeah, I'm not even married to that terminology. I'm just sort of like, yeah,
Okay.
but yeah, I'm certainly trying to express like something like, I would say maybe integral is better, integral versus, although there is to me, like integration is sort of a synthesis, right? Like when you take that, that's kind of what integration is too. So I'm not married to that terminology though.
You know,
I'm
I
kind
saw
of
what you were
looking at some of
describing
the
there.
patterns.
In that sort of dichotomy to me was speaking to aspects of love in terms of mercy and justice.
Yeah,
So
that's really good.
and you have to do both is the problem. And like it's, I don't know, like I feel like depending on how you are temperamentally, you tend to probably one is a lot easier for you to do than the other. In terms of like that openness, that willingness to take the bunny trail is to me conceptually kind of a mercy, right? It's an openness. It's a bringing more into the fold. But then, like you said, it can get out of hand to the point where you can't accomplish something even fairly trivial that you need to get done because real consequences hang in the balance of it being done.
Mhm.
Yep. I think that's exactly right.
Exactly. And so there's the idea of capacity and disposition. And it's easy to treat that with these abstract skills one can discursively come to by long practice. I think that's a very abstract way to view it that doesn't really have a root in the soil of our nature. Whereas this layered stack of realities that go all the way up, where maybe temperament is a more abstract in the sense of higher up, but borrowing from the lower layers can find its place. So men and women both can have the disposition of silence and peace and bringing into selfness for moments of reprieve. But on a lower level, logically, you get in the fairy tales and the shorthand oral tradition, these realities, these abstract dispositions, necessarily coming to particular roles, personages, as any artist has to decide to give it a beard or long hair, right? So you find this in the Bible often. Look for the absence and look for the presence. And one of the ways in which these are cashed out is the contemplative life versus the active life. And these are also gendered. Why? Because that's the fixed state in eternity? No, I mean, we have to realize that they can operate on a level and then move their way up in freedom and also go down in freedom. So for example, what jumped to my mind was in Genesis, notice we don't hear Eve's speech upon meeting the love of her life, her other half. Is it because she, in her heart, harbored resentment for this Adam she was given? You could read that into the negative space between the Torah portions if you wished. You could be a student of that ideology. You could interpret silence that way, or you can interpret it in an infinite number of ways. But the fact is, she is not given language, or she's not given oral language, verbosity there. But Adam, for some reason, is given the verbosity. He is given to say, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. He identifies her. And I think topologically, we're supposed to understand not the war of the sexes, but there are two ways to respond to a gift, to a presentation. There is the Adam, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, this shall be called X because of Y. And then there's the silence of simply coming to and being received. It's fascinating to me.
That's good. That's good. I like how you bring that around to gift too, because particularly in the context of this conversation, because that notion of gift is so fundamental to the way radical Orthodox theology is actually being done. Like that's kind of what it comes down to.
Could you
Is
elaborate
reception
on
of
that?
gift. Well, yeah, that whole notion of like of gift offering is very critical to the way the radical Orthodox theologians are like conceiving of reality. Like the creation is the God's, self-outpouring gift to us, and the proper way for us to be oriented toward that is to reciprocate that by by offering up our acting and doing to God as a reciprocal gift, participating in and showing our gratitude for that the divine donum.
Yeah, I've thought, and I've said this many times before, that I have this deep interest in the anomaly, which is what kind of sent me on this bunny trail in the first place. Jordan Peterson's idea of anomaly being that which stumbles you, gets in your way, creates problems, anything that brings about disorder in your life is the anomaly, and that the anomaly itself is the gift, because that's what brings about growth and the potential for creativity and everything else. And one of my bunny trails this morning, I was cleaning my desk and I had to remove a book because there wasn't enough space for all the books to stand up straight in the spot what I had. And so the book that I pulled out was this one, Art and Fear. And I remembered this book has been very instrumental in my thinking about a lot of things. So I thought, I wonder what's in here. And I popped it open and came to this paragraph. For you, the seed of your next artwork lies embedded in the imperfections of your current piece. Well, that's Jordan Peterson in a nutshell, right? I mean, the guy wrote it in one sentence. It's the whole thing. It comes down to the nature of reality and the universe. And then he goes on in the same section and makes this amazing statement. The depth of your need to make things establishes the level of risk in not making them. And he's talking particularly about the various kinds of obsessions that artists come to when there's many different ways that artists are productive. Sometimes it's just an obsessive need. Sometimes it's a very professional determination to be productive and all of that. But the depth of your need to make things establishes the level of risk in not making them. It occurs to me when I read that is true if you're talking about good things. The depth of your need to make something good or to be participative with something good establishes the level of risk in not participating in the good. But it's also true the other way. The depth of your need to participate in idolatry or participate in something evil or participate in some negative thing establishes the level of risk in participating in it. So that the more you need God, the more you have that passion for him, the deeper the hole in you is for God to fill, establishes the level of risk in not having him. And the more that you need whatever idol it is that you're attracted to, establishes the level of risk in participating in that idol, because there is a consequence, as Michael said earlier, the consequence of, how did you put that?
I think it's the main consequence is just not seeing reality. I mean, like you stop, like that patience just comes to an immediate end, and you feel like you have a representation of what's there, and you've just missed the whole thing. You see something simple where there is something of infinite complexity.
Oh God, I just wrote something about that yesterday. I can't wait to get at that. Maybe I have to just read it online someday, because I don't want to commandeer the conversation, but I have to throw this in here. Here's what C.S. Lewis says about reality. There is always something they insist on keeping, even at the price of misery. There is always something they prefer to joy, that is, reality. He's equating reality and joy. And that's just so perfect when I consider all the things that I've been thinking about. Here's what Jordan Peterson says reality is. And I think he's wrong. I think he's talking about a different kind of reality. Jordan Peterson says reality is the phenomena that emerge as a consequence of ongoing behavior. Well,
Yeah.
what emerges as a consequence of ongoing behavior is whatever happens based on my actions. And you can call that reality if you want to, but how people use the word reality when they come up against it is, oh, I got smacked by reality, which means what they're really saying is that reality is the judge of their actions. Reality is that which you come up against when you are, when you err, the reality that you come up against is a negative consequence. And when you are on the right track, the reality that you come up against is joy, which is what.
That's really good. That's
Yeah,
really good. I also like that you're pointing us toward courage, and I don't think we'll have time to get into this today, but to me, there's a very deep linkage between courage and truth. And I think that we need to come to a Christian understanding of courage that kind of like clearly differentiates it from like from the pagan heroic notion of courage, which is completely different. But as long as you interpret courage in a properly Christian context, I think you're pointing towards something very, very deep and profound.
Did
C.S.
you
Lewis
hear,
liked to
did you hear
say,
Jordan Peterson's conversation with Matthew McConaughey?
I didn't get a chance to watch it yet.
Because on that, Jordan Peterson says humility is courage.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
well, C.S. Lewis liked to say, courage is not one of the virtues, but is every virtue
Yep.
at its testing point.
It's exactly. It's the thing that allows you to practice any other virtue. Without it, you can't. There's no other virtue that's open to you if you don't have courage.
And notice the key words there: practice and open.
Yes.
So there's this opening,
Bingo.
a disclosure, and where then does the courage reside, in what activity? So to borrow from Karen's use of the word in the last conversation, entropy. I want to pun. There's entropy in the thermodynamical systems theory. And then there's trope in oratory. So there's a profound consonance between those in the realm of motion, what moves us and how we move our reasons from one sphere to the next, and how they disintegrate across time, but also how they accumulate and accrete in time. So, for example, you can quickly move in the oral tradition. You can't do it pages in the canon, a late development. Legibility, a late development. But in the oral tradition, you can go from Adam hiding in the bush, where he's entangled in this mundane, to the Gnostic controversy of the relation between the highest that has to break apart to come down into the finite, which is a degradation, that was taken and Christianized for purposes of salvation in the Gospel of John. The Logos comes, invades, no one will receive, and then identifies himself with natural order, light. No one will come to the light because their deeds will be exposed. That's the courage that Adam lacked when he was hiding behind a bush. And this is part of the continuity that John has with the Torah. He's writing from that place of we're all Adam in the bush. How do we come to the proper gnosis? And that was arrived at through oral tradition, not necessarily by flipping between pages of a book.
It's going to take me a year to unpack that.
Well, yeah, I would just say that oral. I definitely am all in favor of oral tradition, and I think it was definitely a characteristic of modernity to be deeply suspicious of the unreliability of oral tradition. But I think even from a social sciences standpoint, we're coming to learned that oral tradition is far more reliable than we thought it was in the not too distant past. So,
But I think
yes.
YouTube and those sorts of things are training us to seek knowledge in this way of these expressions, right? Because it's really clear. If you've spent any time with, say, the text version of a book and the audible version, there's a lot more information in the audible version. Because there's a breathing to life of something, so it makes it does, as Peterson's pointed out, it does make it expands the capacity of the hearer to engage with the work, because in some sense that the speaker is doing some pre-digesting of it and is bringing all this contextual I don't know, supports for understanding into the frame with the work they're doing. And I think that is really interesting and key. My sister, who reads a lot, and she's not Christian, we have a lot of little philosophical battles. She says she doesn't like to do audiobooks because she can criticize the text better when she sees it on the page. I thought that was really telling. There's something there, because it's not as compelling, it's not as persuasive when it's not alive off of somebody with all their idiosyncrasies and all the weirdness of them that they're bringing to bear in terms of a living reality behind the words.
I also think there's a lot more information in these YouTube conversations than there is when people are having a conversation about a book. I think there's more information in the conversation than there is in the book itself. Partly because of the space, the conversational spaces that take place, and the space between all of the people who are speaking about it, but also partly because when you're thinking your way through an idea in order to express that idea, you're leaving lots more place for connections with the listener to fill in the spaces on their own. And so it's exponentiating the number of spaces, the potential for connection with other ideas. So those empty spaces are getting filled up with lots more information. It may not be the information that the book intended, but it's a lot of information that is being produced by the unity of all the people talking about it and all the people listening to it. So you have this huge exponential multiplication of information. And I was thinking about that the other day in terms of history. For a long time, history books have been written based on the letters that historical people wrote to each other, and not even so much based on their actions, but on the letters that they wrote to each other, talking about their actions and their experiences. And then there was a period of time in the United States when nobody was writing, in the whole world, when nobody's writing letters anymore because we're focusing on email. Nobody's going to go back into the email records to get the information about how to write history. But now everything is online in these conversations. This is going to be the foundation of history in the future, if there is a future, and if anybody's interested in history in the future. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Let's all hope there is a future.
Yeah. Well, we don't know when the Lord's going to come back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that, of course, necessitates a hermeneutical practice, right? When we had oral tradition, there was a way of ascertaining, or let me say this, there was a way, presumably, of discerning who was the prophet and who were the disciples, or who were the disciples and what schools of thought did they belong to. And so how could we get them in a room so that we could see the gestalt of the different schools of thought and could see maybe a higher order whole? So I'm not trying to make an Argon of prophets fighting prophets. That's a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. But there had to be a way to discern wheat from chaff, had to discern the simulacrum from real connections. And who knows how they did it, because we don't have it on paper, their rubric. Well, when legibility came to the forefront through close reading in other universities and explication of the text, there was a concerted effort to establish a rubric for interpreting or interpretation. Now, I think where postmodernism saw its chance was you could ask the question, interpretation for what? What were you gaining from a thematic? And with video and with podcasts, who knows what rubrics society will devise to land on a thematic of the spoken word? I don't know.
But doesn't this provide just exactly that opportunity for what Barfield was trying to bring back into the world? Michael,
Well,
do you think?
When you specifically this oral culture, this dialogue that we're participating in right now.
That's depending on the spaces between people, the connections between ideas that are in this strange space that's happening.
Yes, I think I don't know. I have some interesting thoughts about that. Because I do think what we're doing is, in some senses, it's still a further retreat, but it's like we're gathering the resolve to turn around and go the other direction, is what I feel like.
Okay, so what do you mean by further retreat? And then what is the gathering resolve?
Well,
That's
because
so interesting.
if you look at the descent, it's because in some sense we're still, what we're doing now is still intellectual, still disembodied. It's still but I think there's a sort of something in the future that we necessarily need that is embodied. It is communal. It involves the body in practice. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, it's a further elaboration of the church, but a church that suddenly starts to see its identity in unity rather than in division. And I feel like the Bible in certain verses is prophetic of such a future state. Especially the book of Ephesians has some verses that seem where we come into the full measure of the stature of Christ as a body. Like, and specifically the whole book of Ephesians is making these different emblematic ways of conceptualizing this relationship between Christ and the church, and this sort of, it's the body, it's a marriage between the male and the female, and it's this big mystery. But I do think, I don't know, and you can make the argument too, right, that those are pointing to the eschaton, right? That they're pointing to some time beyond all time and space. But I don't know. I feel like something's being worked out here in time and space that matters. That's real. That is preparatory for what comes next. So,
I think maybe what I would, this is. I would say that maybe what the realization that we need to come to, and I think Barfield seems to have a sense of this, I think, is that we participate in the bringing about of that eschaton as the church. And I don't think he would have put it that way, but his Eucharistic focus to me seems to suggest that he does get that on some level, because he sees the Eucharist as key. So it's communion. It's communion. It's something we do together, and if you take the image of the body of Christ deadly seriously, it really should make you rethink how you're interpreting the imagery that is used about the Parousia. What does the second coming really look like? Is it literally Jesus coming as a conqueror in the clouds, or is it something beyond that? And I'm not even remotely ready to begin to offer. I'm just saying it's something worth thinking about.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things the readings of Barfield open up for me, is that wherever that is, it's going to be more strange and wonderful than perhaps one could we would imagine. You know,
which is what we should expect from God. Like, why should we expect it to be something that we could easily wrap our mortal brains around?
It will be the ballerina landing on point, the prosaic meeting the sublime.
That's beautiful. You have quite a way with words, Matthew. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I never know, Matthew, when you're quoting somebody else or when it's something that you came up with yourself.
Oh, it's a chili.
Well, let me just read the very end of the paragraph. We may have covered everything even without reading it. So let me just go on here.
Add to the church piece.
Only
Yeah.
in the infinite Godhead can there be an entire intuition, which is also an infinitely concluded exposition. Truth is possible for us because we participate by an act of faith in this infinite truth. At the fall, humans tried to erect truth for themselves. This is why rationalism is evil. But God himself descended to us and became the truth for us in time. Echoes of this resound through everything ever since, but are concentrated in the church. So I guess the nacre in that oyster is the why rationalism is evil.
It has to do
Have
with what we were
comment on
saying
that?
earlier. Yeah, well, it has to do with what we were saying earlier about postmodernism correctly reducing all rationalistic narratives to power. And that is why it's evil, because it ultimately is about domination. And the Christian narrative presents an alternative, which is in place of power and domination, a narrative based on charity and reconciliation. So that which is why reason that comes from a standpoint of faith is redeemable, even though rationality, which starts from finite premises, is ultimately devolves into power and domination.
So when he says rationalism is evil, he's saying that
Thinking that what do you
through the
mean?
postmodern lens is evil.
Well, or the modern lens too. And actually, this sort of has its roots in bad Catholic theology. But essentially, any reasoning that begins, assume there is no God, and then proceeds from there. He's saying that's the wrong move. It's like we should never assume there is no God and then move from there, because then it's trying to put everything. The minute you make the move, assume there is no God, what you were in fact saying is assume I am God. There's really no difference between those statements.
Well, I think I would again maybe reformulate it a little bit and say rationalism is evil because it eventually cashes out in this nullity, which then leads you to a point where you have to become your own God, which is kind of Nietzsche's move, right? You have to go make your values for yourself.
Will to power. It all becomes will to power. Yeah. Yes.
And
you basically added in the extra step I was missing.
Yeah. But I think
I just jumped to the conclusion.
You could come to like some sort of nihilism as well, but most people don't, because there's too much will to power built into our biological structure as creatures that we don't choose to just off ourselves.
Which is why Milbank ends up saying, this is why Milbank says that the move we need to make is to outcompete it narratively. It's like, because it's not an incoherent narrative, it's a coherent narrative. It's so yeah.
But I think we also have to see the need for the marriage of the logos, small l, and the enchantment, the narrative, the myth. So in Phaedrus, or no, excuse me, yeah, the I don't remember which story it is, but the one where Socrates is turning his legs from the bed. These disciples are gathered around him. In a matter of hours, he's going to drink the hemlock, and they begin to philosophize about the immortality of the soul.
I think that's the Phaedo.
Thank
the Phaedo,
you.
not the Phaedrus. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Before he goes into his theory of recollection, he gives a little side remark about the value of myth. And I think it's so interesting here because, Michael, I think this is the tree you've been barking up for some time. And I owe this insight to you. It's my rosary, one of the beads of my tropological rosary, as it were. He says that before we follow the small l logos to wherever it leads, which would bring him into his theory of recollection, notice how closely aligned this is with the discourse in St. John as Jesus is about to be taken in the garden. There are differences, but there are profound similarities. Socrates says offhandedly, The power of a myth resides in its ability to enchant us and give us a strength we may not naturally possess to think the good in spite of all present evidence.
That's great.
And he doesn't, which is not a remark on the validity of the myth, but is a remark to the persuasive capacity of that thing to blow up in the mind and get you to help someone across the street, or whatever the anecdote turns out to be of your nice thing in life that you were able to do because you had the right enchantment or spell casted or proverb recalled. And this is before he goes into his theory, his philosophical musings. And that prior move, that anterior reliance on myth, is so important because it means we can't rely merely on myth, but we can't make myth the end or the telos of our community. Like I'm a strict dialectician. I don't think the goal of the intellect is to devise a meta myth. I think that's a fool's errand, in my opinion, because the myth is supposed to be a thing that enchants one to go between the lines and actually anticipate the horizon where God could show up. A rationalism could invent a mega myth. There are computer programs that write novels. So it's not about constructing the narrative. It's about choosing wisely narratives and pastiche of narratives to get going to a more faithful walk into the unknown, which is dialectics. And I think that's hand in glove with oral tradition and what actually will grease the wheels of the next nouveau oral tradition for Christianity.
In a little way, Jordan Peterson has added a lot to that piece of truth right there when he makes the comment that trusting that when you speak the truth, what comes will be good, is basically trusting the nature of reality, trusting that the nature of reality is good. And that's what keeps you from falling into nihilism. And that was, some of you know some of my story, the various things that have happened to me in life that I guess some people would characterize as traumatic, disruptive, tragedies and all of that kind of thing. But the thing that I learned early on in that process through those experiences was that if I thought it through all the way to the bottom, the conclusion I came to is God is good. God is good all the time. So if that's my base truth, that God is good all the time, then whatever this is that's happening, there is some good that can come out of it. It's not that the thing itself is good. The thing itself might be a very bad thing, and it may not have been the thing that anybody would choose, but something good can come out of it. And so if that's your baseline, God is good, then that informs the way you look at everything. And it allows you to trust, it allows you to be patient, it allows you to hope, it allows you to listen. So yeah.
I think that's what you didn't make the connection explicit, but I think that is what Peterson contributed, right? Which is he wouldn't say God, he would say being, but he gives you very strong arguments to come to that conclusion that being is good in spite, and not a sort of naive, Pollyannish, sort of view of that goodness, but a real looking, like trying to go actually do the exact opposite of it, go to the exact, the furthest, darkest places of the human soul and history and reality. And from that place say being is good, would be his language. But I think, ultimately is God.
That would be the Platonic language too, right? That's the Platonism is looking toward the good as the ultimate form of all forms. So,
but it can't just be the telos. It also has to be the substrate. I've given that a lot of thought.
Right. Aristotle is the one who makes it just the telos. Like Plato's thought is yes, it actually the good participates in all the particular individuation in Plato's thought. He's actually not. Plato is not the dualist that a lot of people think he is. He's a little bit more complicated than that. So, but that would be a long segue.
Well, let me just wrap it up in terms of, from the artistic point of view, you have a substrate, which is, your canvas or your piece of paper or whatever it is you're going to do your work of art on. And then you have your vision of what you think it's going to be. And the vision acts as, the vision is kind of your long view, and it's what brings things into alignment for the work that you're going to do on the painting, but it also keeps you striving to improve your skills so that future paintings will be better. And so it acts as the telos. Okay, so the vision, your artistic vision is the telos, and then you have the substrate, and the your vision always goes beyond your skill. It always outruns your skill. So you always have to keep moving. The other day I heard some woman on Lex Friedman's podcast, and she made the comment that so-and-so had said, truth is a moving target. And I thought, no, that's not quite right. What's right is that truth appears to be a moving target to us, because when we head for the truth, our direction is always a little bit off. And so we have to keep recalibrating. We have to keep building new tools to get there. So truth appears to be a moving target, but you have to have the vision and you have to have the substrate. What happens in between is going to be filled with attempts and failures and successes and all of those things combined. And at the end, you may not end up with what you want, but you have the vision to lead you to the next option, the next movement. And you could look at all of the universe like that if you're thinking about, even if you think from an evolutionary standpoint of all the mistakes that happened in evolution, those are all the path that makes its way onto the vision. But you have to have the substrate has to be good, and the final vision has to be good. If the substrate is not good, then everything that's laid on top of it just falls off. When you're doing a piece of work, if your substrate is not good, it's going to disintegrate and you're going to lose the whole work. Well, then the work itself is not just what you're putting on the canvas, but it's what was in your mind when you put it on there, and how it looks to you when you're done, and how it looks to other people, and how it communicates. And so it's this whole big picture of the substrate and the telos, or the vision.
Yeah, data compression.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we wrapped up number 5.
I think so.
Who's willing to go for number 6?
I'm in.
Are you guys both free at the same time next week?
Yeah, this time usually works for me. Yep.
Great. I think this is a very productive quadruped here.
We lost Matt. I think his phone might have died.
I think he dropped out. Yeah, I don't know what happened. But yeah.
I'm sure he'll be back.
Great conversation. Thank you all.
And so I'm going to take a look at mine and see how much of it got mucked up by my instability on the internet. And you can send me the one that you.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks so much. See you guys next week.
Yeah. See you next week. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.